Hello, everybody, and welcome to BeerSmith Podcast number 31. Today, our guest is Dr. Charlie Bamforth, the professor of Brewing Science at the University of California, Davis. In the news arena, I posted a new open beta of BeerSmith 2 for Linux. If you go to the BeerSmith.com website and go to the main download page, you can download that beta. I've set it up initially for Ubuntu Linux, so you can give that a try, and I'm working on other versions as well. I want to mention that this week's sponsor is More Beer at beersmith.com/morebeer. They're suppliers of brewing ingredients, fine equipment, and supplies. And when you place an order through the links at beersmith.com/morebeer, you'll be supporting the show. And now, without further ado, let's go into this week's interview. Today on the show, my guest is Dr. Charlie Bamforth, who's the Pope of Foam. He's also the professor of Brewing Science at the University of California, Davis. And he's been on the show twice before talking about both beer foam in Podcast 23 and also mashing in Podcast 14. He's also among our most downloaded guests to date. So, Charlie, it's great to have you back on the show.
Very nice to be with you again. Thanks for asking me.
Really appreciate you doing this.
My pleasure.
Today we want to talk a little bit about Diacetyl. And so let's start at the very beginning and describe what that is.
Well, it's a pretty small molecule that's made or derived from yeast, and it smells of popcorn, butterscotch, that sort of buttery sort of flavor. And most people would consider it to be a negative in the context of beer.
So I read that the production, it's actually used in the production of artificial butter. Is that right?
Yes, it is, and also popcorn. It's the smell that keeps me out of movie theaters. That's one of the things that keeps me out of movie theaters. The other one is any violence in films. So when we spot a film we like, my wife and I go there, and there's nobody else goes to see the sorts of films I want to see. But right before the movie starts, in comes somebody with the biggest box of popcorn you've ever seen in your life, and the stink. Oh my God, the stink. So it is used in production of things like popcorn and certain buttery aromas and so on. But I for my palate at least, don't much care for it when it's anywhere near a beer.
Now, I understand it's also pretty strong stuff. One of the articles I read said you can taste it in as little as 50 parts per billion. Is that right?
Yes, you can. And the fact is that the gentler the flavor of the beer, the more obvious it becomes, and the lower the level you need to get to. And so if you've got should we say, a subtly flavored lager-style beer, then the flavor threshold for Diacetyl is going to be lower than it is in a more robust stout, should we say. There's actually one other chemical compound that's very closely related to it, and that's called pentane-dione. And that's just got one extra carbon atom in it, and it smells of honey. And it's not quite so potent as Diacetyl, but nonetheless, it is one that brewers need to worry about. And so what brewers talk about is what we call total VDKs. VDK means vicinal diketone. You don't really need to worry about that, but really what they're talking about is Diacetyl and this pentane-dione.
So what is it formally, and where does it come from?
Well, both of these things come from offshoots of metabolism in the yeast. When the yeast is growing in a fermenter, and when it's making the alcohol, it also is trying to make some other things, including certain amino acids. And one of the intermediates that is on the way to those amino acids comes out of the yeast cell. It just leaks out of the yeast cell, and it breaks down spontaneously to make Diacetyl. And there's another similar intermediate that breaks down to form pentane-dione. So they're pretty much unavoidable without some pretty radical ways of modifying things. They're always going to be produced in a fermentation. The good news is that the yeast actually takes them back up again later.
So that applies to both ale and lager, right? I mean, it's produced.
Absolutely, it applies to all beers. You know, this stuff is produced, both Diacetyl and pentane-dione, And as I say, it needs to be mopped up again. Some people actually do strongly feel that perhaps for some beers, and really we're primarily talking about some of the darker ales, that a little bit of diacetyl perhaps is helpful in balancing the flavor. And of course, in terms of lagers, there's some beers out of the Czech Republic that actually do contain some significant levels of diacetyl. So it would be wrong for me to say absolutely it's a no-no and it's a 100% categorically negative. There are some people who like a little bit of it. I guess these people are also people who like to drink some of those Chardonnays that are loaded with diacetyl.
Well, since it's a byproduct of fermentation, what can you do during the fermentation to actually help control it?
Well, as I say, the fact is it is spontaneously produced, but then the yeast mops it up again. So there are several things you can do. The first is that you really do need to have good, healthy yeast. And if you've got a virile yeast, shall we say, that is in good condition, then and the right amount of it, you're not shorting the amount of yeast that you're putting in, then you should have at the end of fermentation enough healthy yeast to mop up the diacetyl and the pentanedione. Some people actually boost the yeast count later on in fermentation, and this is a process called krausening. And what you do with krausening is you had a very, very large cell count of young yeast towards the end of the fermentation, and that yeast is so vigorous that it not only mops up its own diacetyl and pentanedione, it does that in the parent fermentation as well. One of the tricks that we used to apply in the company I was research manager for in England, Bass, one of the things we used to do was to allow the temperature midway through the fermentation to start to rise a little bit. So without giving the actual fermentation temperatures away, and of course remembering that we were always working in degrees Celsius or centigrade, then if you allow the temperature to rise perhaps 1 or 2 degrees Celsius in the midpoint in the fermentation, that helps to speed up the metabolism and helps to speed up the mopping up of the diacetyl. So it really does depend on how low you need it to get. As I say, if you're dealing with many of the ales and so on, perhaps you would be targeting less than, let's say, 0.1 part per million, 100 parts per billion, something like that. But if you're making a very gently flavored, shall we say, North American lager, then chances are the specification for that will be much lower than that. And so really that's why so much effort is put into trying to mop it up, and that is one of the reasons beyond prolonged lagering times and storage times for that yeast to mop up the diacetyl and the pentanedione.
So, I mean, this is what people call a diacetyl rest, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's making sure you have got enough of the yeast left behind in a good, healthy state to mop up that diacetyl and the pentanedione.
And what about krausening again? It's not, we're not talking about the sort of krausening that people probably commonly refer to for doing carbonation. We're actually talking about something different here, right?
Well, this is a proper use of the term krausening. So when some of the larger brewers do the krausening process, that is very much an exercise in getting rid of these VDKs, these vicinal diketones. That is why we're doing it.
So for krausening, are you adding additional wort at that point, or are you just adding yeast?
It's really the most important thing you're adding is a very large count of some very young and vigorous and active yeast, 40 or more million cells per mil of this vigorous yeast added as a percentage of the parent brew.
Wow. So, I mean, you're adding, you'd have a starter going probably to make something like this and get it actively fermenting before you throw it in.
Absolutely right. The key to diacetyl and pentanedione control really is this, it's so important to have healthy, vigorous yeast, and that is why I'm always an advocate of making sure that you look after the yeast. You treat the yeast like one of the family. Treat it with great respect, and it'll it'll do the job for you.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
Now, I understand you can also get diacetyl from bacterial infection. So can you talk for a minute about that?
Yeah, you can. And that is one of the big differences between bacteria and yeasts. Yeasts, as I've said, they produce both diacetyl and this pentanedione. But bacteria, like the Pediococci especially, some of the lactic acid bacteria, they produce much more diacetyl than pentanedione. Right, so I never forget the time I was in a bar in Portland with my wife, and she gets very cross with me because I never ever complain in restaurants. I eat the wrong food and never complain. But on this particular occasion, I had a very well-known North American beer, and I sent it back, and I said, didn't smell like this when it left the brewery. And she shrugged her shoulders and said, "Well, choose something else." And my wife was very relieved I didn't say, "Do you know who I am?" That was a classic example of dirty dispense lines, contaminated dispense lines. And that is the biggest problem for a really overt diacetyl character is chances are it's because of somebody who's not cleaning the lines in the bar and so on. And that's why, I'm always suspicious when I go into these bars with loads and loads of beers on tap. And this can be one of the very real problems. So bacteria certainly can, some of them very vigorously produce diacetyl.
So what roles do heat and contact with the yeast play in developing this diacetyl rest?
Well, contact with yeast, as I say, is very important in terms of getting rid of it. And I mentioned the thing about heating or allowing the fermentation to rise to speed things up. But heat is very important in another way. And that is that by heating, you actually break down the materials that are converted into diacetyl and pentanedione, these so-called precursors. So the stuff that leaks out of the yeast cell, as I say, breaks down to give diacetyl, and something else breaks down to give pentanedione. And if you heat up the beer, then they break down quicker. They break down more quickly.
Interesting.
And one of the standard things that brewers do on a commercial scale, before they measure how much diacetyl and pentanedione they have using the gas chromatogram, the thing they do is they take a small sample of the beer and basically they cook it. They heat it very strongly. And in that way, they force these precursors into the diacetyl and pentanedione. So in this way, what you're doing is making sure you're not only measuring the free vicinal diketone, you're also measuring this, the precursors. And that's very important because if you just measure diacetyl and pentanedione, and you say, okay, they're okay, we've got rid of those, and then you separated the beer from the yeast, you may still have those precursors. And in the beer itself, in the package, they could slowly break down to give you diacetyl and pentanedione. So when we talk about absolutely total vicinal diketones, what we're talking about is measuring the diacetyl, the pentanedione, and the two molecules that they come from, that they're made from. And then we have an absolute level of the total potential for this off flavor, and we make sure that it's below a certain level before we move the beer on. Now, one company in Finland actually take advantage of this, and many brewers throw up their hands in horror when they hear about it. But this company actually take the beer, the green beer, fresh from fermentation, without any sort of maturation stage at all, and they centrifuge it, take all the yeast out of it, and then they heat it up for 7 minutes at 90 degrees Celsius, so that's 194 Fahrenheit.
Wow. Almost.
And most brewers go, wow. And of course, what they're doing
you're almost pasteurizing it at that point, right?
I
said you're almost pasteurizing it at that point.
Yeah, beyond that, way beyond that. And what they're doing is breaking down these precursor molecules into diacetyl and pentanedione, and then what they do is they flow that heated beer through a column, and in the column is packed yeast. It's packed solid with yeast, or not solid, but heavily packed with good young yeast that's sticking onto a particle or particles. And that yeast gets rid of the not only the diacetyl and the pentanedione, but also anything nasty that was produced during the heating stage. And so within minutes, they're achieving their maturation, their downstream VDK control in a very, very short space of time. Now, of course, this was designed by chemical engineers, people with no real sense of the beauty of life, but nonetheless, and I'm only teasing, of course, but the beer is actually really rather good. And it just shows that you can actually speed up the process. There is another trick that some people do, Brad, and if you're prepared to do it, and that is there is an enzyme. It's a bacterial enzyme that you can buy commercially, and it goes under the trade name Maturex. And this is an enzyme that will take the molecule that diacetyl is made from, and it will turn that molecule directly into something called acetoin. And I hope this doesn't sound too complicated, but when the yeast takes back up the diacetyl, what it does is it makes it into something called acetoin. And that doesn't have the same flavor at all. So by using this enzyme called Maturex, you actually go directly from the precursor through to acetoin, and you miss out diacetyl. And so you don't make the diacetyl in the first place. And so you can actually put that into the fermentation. You can avoid the downstream storage on the yeast, the maturation stage.
So you actually add that before you ferment? Is that right?
Yeah, well, you add it during the fermentation.
During the fermentation. And where would you get
right
something
at the start
like
of the fermentation. And so any of this precursor that comes out of the yeast cell, the enzyme sees it and just straight away takes it away and prevents it from being converted into diacetyl.
And where would you pick up something like that?
Well, there's enzyme companies that sell it. So if you just go to the internet and put in the keyword Maturex, Maturex, then that'll take you to somewhere where you can buy it. I have no idea what the price is. I have no idea whether it's prohibitive on a small scale, but and I can't tell you, and I wouldn't tell you anyway, which larger brewing companies are using it, if any. Okay. But it's certainly on the market, and it's certainly a potential solution.
So can you talk for just a minute about the precursors as well? I mean, you mentioned them, but you didn't talk specifically about
Well, I didn't, because although I get all excited by chemicals and chemical formulae and so on, not everybody does, but the precursors, the diacetyl comes from something called acetolactate. And the pentanedione comes from something called acetohydroxybutyrate. And as I say, these molecules are intermediates on the pathway by which the yeast makes some of its amino acids, things like valine and leucine. And so these are intermediates. They're made by the yeast from ultimately from the sugars. So the sugars go in, the sugars are broken down. Of course, they do produce alcohol, but also some of them get sidetracked into making things like acetolactate and acetohydroxybutyrate.
So is there some way to tell when the diacetyl rest is done or the krausening process is done?
Well, there is on a commercial scale, yeah. As I say, you measure the things by gas chromatography. There is in the recommended methods of the American Society of Brewing Chemists, the ASBC, there's a color method for doing it, and I guess if you stretch to a spectrophotometer, you could do that. But my advice is really to control it by good practice, by making sure you've got healthy yeast. You look after the yeast, you put in the right quantity of yeast, and by trial and error, you have the conditions in the fermentation and the storage conditions whereby you will deal with the diacetyl and the pentanedione. And the only way on a really small scale to do that, of course, is by the power of smell. So if you are confident that you can't smell these things anymore, and of course making sure that you've got total hygiene throughout the process and there's no risk of these lactic acid bacteria developing, that is the way to do it. Even on a commercial scale, certainly on the smaller commercial scales, my advice to brewers always is, it's all about doing it right. It's all about controlling your process, controlling the the yeast pitching rate, controlling the quality of the yeast, controlling the times and temperatures. And then if you got it right and it's all hygienic, then at the end of the day, you should have these VDKs under control.
So, I mean, does fermentation temperature and fermentation conditions, does that really come into play here? Pitching rate, does that significantly affect
pitching rate
production?
is very significant because, it's going to influence the, and even more so, the actual pitching of viable, healthy yeast. It is going to come into its own later on in the fermentation when we're wanting to scavenge these VDKs. Clearly, it's important in terms of achieving a consistent fermentation. And I know there are some people out there that get weary of me talking about consistency, but consistency, I think, is very, very important. So you've got consistent excellence. And if you want a consistent product and a really good product that you can be confident it's going to meet your expectations, then the thing you need to control is the fermentation. Mm-hmm. You need to control the pathway of that fermentation. And the way to do that is to regulate the starting gravity, to regulate the yeast count in relation to that starting gravity, and to make sure it's good yeast, it's healthy yeast. And then downstream, when it's finished doing the fermentation, then you will have yeast that is capable and able to deal with these VDKs and get rid of them. So it really is all about yeast management and fermentation control.
Now, at the end of fermentation, a lot of home brewers are in a big rush to drink the beer, so they try really hard. They throw in a bunch of additives to get the yeast to precipitate out and so on. But it sounds like if you actually want to control this, you actually want to leave it in contact with the yeast for a period of time, right? Yeah, but
it will, as I say, it really will depend on the beer. Without naming the brand of beer that I was referring to earlier on, that we allowed the temperature rise, the length of time we had to leave the beer in contact with the yeast to mop up the last traces of diacetyl and pentane diene was not very long. We're talking a day or two. Mm-hmm. And that is because we'd really controlled it through the fermentation with this temperature rise and the quality of the yeast and so on. And once we were confident that we got those VDKs, the total VDK, as I described earlier, below our target, our specification, then our philosophy was, for goodness sake, get the yeast off, chill the beer down to -1 degree Celsius for 3 days, and then put it in a package and get it into the consumer. We didn't really want to have beer loitering in the brewery. We'd far sooner be selling it out in the trade and getting some money back into the company. So, there's a lot to be said for, in my opinion, for not loitering. But of course, let me say again, it will depend on the beer. The beer I was talking about, it was a lager style beer, but it had a fairly substantial flavor. Some of the gently flavored products, you will need that little bit longer to really bring that VDK down to within specification, because it's going to be lower.
Well, you mentioned a couple beer styles that where diacetyl might be actually a good thing. Can you give us a couple examples of that?
Well, I'm not going to name names, but I mean, I think I've narrowed it down. If I talk about the Czech Republic, there are some fairly prominent lagers from there that if you go into the Czech Republic, you'll see that there's a very much a VDK nose on them, and you better ask them why it's there. But some of the darker English ales, possibly people say that perhaps. A little bit of VDK is desirable. It does not sit comfortably with me. But beer is all about opinions. And what I think is nectar, you may think is poison and vice versa. What I would say about diacetyl is that if you do have a serious problem with it, particularly because of a contamination of a dispense line and so on, this really does make many beers pretty much undrinkable. Mm-hmm. And it's certainly, people talk about drinkability and so on. I would say that one of the big negatives and one of the things that limits drinkability is diacetyl. This butterscotch note, if it's anything like a significant quantity, because it does seem to build up. It does seem to linger and accumulate. And I'll never forget, I was in a bar once with a very prominent brewer, a lady brewer, actually, brewster. And we were both sitting there. We took one sip, and she just pushed her glass towards me, and she said, "I can't drink that." She said, "You drink it." I said, "Well, why should I drink it?" She says, "Because you're kinder than I am." But I couldn't drink it either. I mean, it's just nasty. And that was that particular bar had a real severe contamination problem.
Wow. Mm. Well, I just wanted to summarize one more time. So, an average home brewer, let's say you're making a beer, and you're trying to control the diacetyl in the beer. Mm-hmm. So you would recommend a diacetyl rest at, for example, what temperature maybe, roughly?
Well, I'm going to talk Celsius, so you're going to have to convert it into Fahrenheit and so on. But
I'll put it in the show notes.
If you're making a lager style product, then let's say you're fermenting at let's say 12 Celsius, then what I was used to was allowing that temperature to rise to 13, 14 Celsius midway through the fermentation. Literally at the halfway point when the gravity's dropped about half as far as it's going to go. And then continue at that fermentation temperature. And then by the time you've come to the final attenuation, perhaps a day or two longer, I think you'll probably be in pretty good shape. For an ale, of course, you're actually going to be fermenting at a somewhat warmer temperature anyway. So, as long as you've got a good, healthy yeast count, then by the time you come to the end of that fermentation, then you probably wouldn't want to or need to linger too long, particularly with some of these ales that have got a fairly high flavor charge from whether it's a strong roasted character or a hoppy character. Mm-hmm. Then I really would not recommend hanging around too long.
So you don't do much there. And this is all during the primary, right? This is during the primary fermentation related.
I'll never forget, I was in Copenhagen once. I was at a fancy meeting of the European Brewery Convention Biochemistry Group. And this guy was talking about genetically modifying yeast to put in a gene or change the gene structure of the yeast so that it dealt with the diacetyl so much more quickly. And I just stood up and I said, this is a really exotic solution to what is a really very simple product. And there were a lot of people in the audience who weren't desperately pleased with me for being so blunt about it. But, the reality is you don't need to resort to too many fancy ways of doing it. If you are looking after your yeast and attending to good fermentation practice.
And then finally, if you're working with a very light beer, where it might really make a difference, krausening, how would you go about doing that, an average home brewer?
Well, any opportunity to actually perhaps introduce a fairly large yeast count downstream, as long as you can do it in a hygienic sort of way. I mean, that is basically what they're doing. They are blending into the fermentation on a large scale, blending in, say, I don't know what, less than 10% of a very, very high yeast count, vigorously fermenting young yeast. So, I'm not a home brewer. You know what's within your limitations, what's within your capabilities, and as long as you're not going to jeopardize hygiene, then you try to achieve that. But what it is all about boosting that final yeast count. But I will say again that that I think is a technique that really is going to be much more important for a gentle and a very subtly flavored product, much more so than many of the products that I suspect your listeners are making.
Excellent. And then I got just one final question I wanted to ask. Is that done at the end of the primary fermentation? Or
yes,
towards
the end of the primary fermentation.
Primary fermentation, okay. Well, I guess, is there anything else you'd like to add, Charlie?
No, I think it's, I think we've covered most of the points. I will stress again that it would be it'd be wrong of me to actually say that thou shalt not like diacetyl. I personally don't, and I've got a very, very strong sensitivity to it, and really, it's an aroma that offends me in pretty much any product. But it may be that you feel that in terms of the flavor profile, the spectrum of your particular style of beer, and it's much more likely to be an ale rather than lager, it may be that you feel a little bit of it is helpful. But that's by trial and error, and the way to achieve that level of it, really, it's all the same stuff, but you would need to control your fermentation such that you're, by experience, delivering the flavor profile that you want for that particular beer in whatever way you can achieve it.
Well, Charlie, thanks again for being on the show. I really appreciate you being here and sharing all that with us. A lot of brewing knowledge that certainly a lot of homebrewers don't have.
Always a pleasure. Buy the books.
By the way, do you want to mention a couple of your books, Charlie?
No,
Go ahead.
I don't want to mention the books.
No, take a chance. Take a shot.
No.
Just one or two titles.
I made the mistake of reading a review or two on Amazon, and there are some people that really just don't get it, But what can you do? What can you do? And
So I want everybody to go online on Amazon and put positive book reviews for all of Charlie's books.
I'm not going to curry favor, that's fine. But
I'm just joking.
I know. But some of these people, if they really don't know anything, they really should perhaps keep their mouth shut. But anyway, that's fine. It's all about opinion, and everybody's an expert. Well, so that's just fine and dandy.
Well, you won't put a plug in, so you won't put a plug in, so I'll put a plug in. You can find many of Charlie's books on Amazon.com. Just look for Dr. Charles Bamforth.
All right, including the one on soccer goalkeepers as well.
I didn't know you wrote a book on soccer goalkeepers.
That's what I wanted to be. I didn't want to be a beer guy. I wanted to be the Wolverhampton Wanderers goalkeeper, but I never made it. But I wrote a book about it instead.
That's
Some
fantastic.
of my brewer friends said, you can either brew or you write about it. You write about it. You got to have a sense of humor in this life.
I think it's fantastic.
All right.
Well, thank you again, Charlie.
All right. Good to talk to you. Bye-bye.
So again, that was Dr. Charles Bamforth. He's the professor of brewing science at the University of California at Davis. Well, I'd like to say thank you one more time to our sponsor, which is More Beer at beersmith.com/morebeer. They're suppliers of equipment, ingredients, kits, everything you need for home brewing. And when you place an order through beersmith.com/morebeer, you'll be supporting the show. I'd like to say thank you one more time to Dr. Charlie Bamforth for appearing on the show. And finally, I'd like to thank you for listening. I hope you have a great brewing week.